in a bilingual school for several years. He has published ELT materials and delivered numerous workshops on language and methodology. His master's dissertation was on social translanguaging in a bilingual primary school in Argentina, where he lives and works. During Leandro's session, we recommend watching in speaker view, and if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Over to you. Please share your screen, Leandro.
Is that all right? Can you see that?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Leandro. I'm speaking to you from the city of La Plata, which is the capital of the Buenos Aires province in Argentina. I wish I could see you all, and I wish I could ask you where you're from, but time is of the essence. So on we go into translanguaging, a topic that I myself discovered in the past few years doing a master's in bilingual education with the University of Birmingham. A topic that I chanced upon really, and that I started exploring. And then I found the way to include it in the different papers that I had to write for my master's, even if the main focus was not really translanguaging. And finally, my dissertation was about translanguaging. So I suppose the first thing that I'd like to say to you, especially if you are an early career teacher, is try and find your passion. Try and find a topic that you're really interested in and that you can read about and talk to your colleagues about, and hopefully even undertake formal studies about. Before we actually discuss and define and talk about applications of translanguaging, I'd like to ask you a few questions, just for you to think about. Of course, I'm not expecting you to type your answers to the questions. What languages do you speak? Do you speak your students' language or languages? How many languages are spoken by your students in your classrooms? You're probably familiar with EFL and ESL, English as a foreign language and second language, a related concept that has been generated in connection to the topic of translanguaging as EAL, English as an additional language. Among other reasons, because it's difficult to know if our students, which exactly is their second and their third and their fourth language. So the A of additional kind of takes the pressure off deciding that. It's one more language that our students might add to their linguistic repertoire. More importantly, is the mother tongue of your students in any way allowed in your classrooms? I'm a native speaker of Spanish, and I grew up learning English, and then my teachers around me. And even today, although it's been a long time since I was first trained, even today, in many contexts that I'm familiar with, the mother tongue seems to be a bit of a bad word. And no, let's not use our students' mother tongue, even if we know it. Let's, to some extent, pretend that our students do not have earlier languages that they bring with them to the classroom, and those languages are part of their identity. They're not simply words and grammar. So think about that question, because I think there's still this very strong idea around the world. What ages do you teach? What context do you teach in schools, in language academies? Do you have 1 or 2 weekly hours only with your students? Because teachers will sometimes argue, I've only got a couple of hours a week with my students. And if I'm going to start thinking about other languages than English, then what happens with English, which is my main concern to some extent, my main job? Well, hopefully in the next 20 minutes, you'll give some thought to little ways in which those students' earlier languages and identities can be respected, and your work on English can actually be boosted and improved by making reference to those other languages. Can you collaborate with other teachers in your context at all? Language teachers or other areas? Can you do a little bit of CLIL, content and language integrated learning, even if your institution does not work on the basis of Khalil, can you still reach out to other teachers who might speak other languages? And this was a fascinating question to me when I first read it. I saw it in some of the reading and I said, how can I possibly help students maintain their original languages if I don't speak those languages myself? Well, you don't really have to speak or even understand those languages to generate an interest per se, which quickly put would be the flexible use of all available linguistic resources in a particular communicative situation. Ofelia Garcia is Mexican-American and has produced a lot of work based on Ken Williams, the person to first come up with the term translanguaging in Wales, not so long ago. And then Ofelia Garcia and Kanagaraja as well, who is himself from Sri Lanka and has lived and worked in the United States for quite a number of years. Interestingly, they're both embodiments of bilingualism and multicultural contexts. You can watch videos by them on YouTube. Besides reading by them, there are very interesting interviews and recording by both Garcia and Kanagaraja, who actually speaks more of translingualism and translingual practices. Code switching, which you're probably a bit more familiar with as a concept, is incorporated by translanguaging scholars who take the concept further and argue that rather than focus on the code, the language itself, we should focus on the users. Probably the most controversial concept within the translanguaging construct is the idea that there are no named languages, that English and French and Spanish are historical artifacts that governments and states have made sure that they have kept on existing, but that really there's much more overlap between languages, and any single user who speaks more than one language really is a multilingual person with a number of repertoires in their head. What happens with the E, of course, if we accept that there are no named languages, what happens in the E of IATEFL even, and EFL and TESOL, because the E is for English, of course. But just to mention that this is as far as translanguaging scholars have gone in suggesting that bilinguals are actually not two monolinguals in one head and one body, but actually a single user with their own linguistic repertoire. Jim Cummings has come up with this interesting notion of CUP, common underlying proficiency. His research, part of it anyway, focused on this idea that underneath the individual lexicogrammatical systems of each independent language, there lies a conceptual framework that cuts across all the languages that a person might speak. And that notion is very powerfully related to the notion of translanguaging. A few practical uses now. I'm going to speak for as much as possible and then leave a couple of minutes at the end. So if you've got your questions, because I'm not sure I can read them while I'm talking, but then at the end, I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have, if that sounds all right. Macro alternation is separated from macro alternation in translanguaging suggestions. One of the things that micro alternation means is that within one communicative event, even within one sentence, there can be a bit of two or more languages. And macro alternation would be a whole communicative event, a whole stretch of discourse in one language, and then another stretch of discourse in another language. Time, places, and people are three powerful angles from which to consider whether in your teaching or in your institution there can be an amount of enabling of voices. For example, at one moment in time, one language is more enabled. There is the possibility that students discuss using multiple languages. Something shocking has happened, for example. You may be familiar with this shocking bit of news from Argentina in the past few days. Diego Maradona has died, the sports star. And imagine my students don't have the necessary level in English to discuss Maradona and his death, his life, his controversies. Well, why not then enable 5 minutes, 10 minutes in which the students can use their mother tongue? You can enable breakout rooms now that we've been teaching online so much this year, according to their languages. As long as after the 5 minutes or 10 minutes, we go back into English and we try to build a list of keywords, we try to write a report, prepare a presentation, any activity that you may think that you may want to do by respecting your students' burning need to talk about something very fresh and very recent that they really feel like talking about, rather than the topic that you have probably prepared for the day. The same for place, the same for people. There can be places in one same institution where either a variety of languages are allowed or not. Or with some teachers, for example, today they work on a science project with you in English, and you try and work with some other teacher who tomorrow in another language can work with the same project. And that will be an example of macro alternation across classrooms, across teachers, across time slots. Why not involve the family for those languages that you may not speak? There's nothing as memorable for a kid as a family member coming to the classroom, an online lesson, to read a story, and then your student will never be motivated to summarize in English what their grandmother or what their uncle could have read in a language that maybe the rest of the students don't understand. So family visits, instances of our students' family members interpreting different things for us. The interesting notion of preview, view, and review, a little bit like the 1, 2, 3 that every lesson is about, isn't it? Because every lesson tends to have an introduction, a warm-up, then a main task, and then a wrap-up or closing phase of some kind. So translanguaging experts have recommended that you can do one of these phases or two predominantly in one language, and then another phase in another language. Even if you don't speak those languages, again, in one of the phases, the students may, for example, preview, look up information on their cell phones, their tablets, their computers in their original language. So they do preview reading in their original language, and then the main viewing task in English. I want to show you a concrete example of a South African teacher that works in my school. She's called Lauren. And of course, I've got her permission to use this. This was for a 5-year-old class, and it's one of these many activities that this year we've had to record ourselves and share with our students. She's an arts teacher, and what I'd like you to try and notice is all the English that she uses, of course, but also the Spanish bits that she uses. Try to think about where she uses bits of Spanish and possibly why. I've, of course, subtitled the Spanish bit so that you can understand the bits that she says in Spanish as well. Let me know if you can't hear the audio. I hope you can hear it as well as say it.
Hello everyone, how are you today? Today for art, you're going to need a paper towel, a serviette, colored pens, and water in a spray bottle. No sé si van a poder ver, pero este paper towel tiene muchos puntitos. Y yo voy a llenar esos puntitos con colors. Okay, once I've filled my paper towel with colored dots, I'm going to put it inside a bandeja and spray water on it y observar qué pasa con los colors. Are you ready? Well, I hope you have fun exploring with little dots, paper towels, and water at home. Bye everyone, see you next week.
Interesting, isn't it? How she uses a lot of English, but you must have seen the Spanish bits with the subtitles. Lauren has been working with us for 5 years, and at my school, we legitimize translanguaging. We actually make a point of studying and helping each teacher develop their own translanguaging style. We can do that to some extent because our students are with us for 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day, even some of them. So we've got a lot of time to meet on the one hand, the local ministry regulations of educating our students in Spanish, because that's the official language in Argentina, but then at the same time, working quite a lot with English because of the bilingual program that we've submitted and that we've had approved by the local education ministry. So if you analyze Lauren's translanguaging a little bit, you must have seen that there are certain keywords. For example, she's speaking Spanish and still she uses words like paper towels or colors in English. Is that because they are keywords? Because they are words that she has used before? Because they are so clear from what she's showing that she does not need to resort to Spanish? And by the same token, interestingly, in the middle of the English flow, she uses bandeja, the Spanish word for tray, although she's actually showing it. So for some reason, she felt the need, possibly because the parents this year have had to be of more help than ever, especially with the younger kids. And so she must have felt that maybe using the word bandeja, even if she was showing it, was something that could contribute to the understanding of the activity. Translanguaging can initially be planned and scripted even, and then it can become more and more spontaneous. And I'm sure you all use your bits of translanguaging here and there. So maybe what you can do is you can record yourself and you can observe your own teaching, your own translanguaging, like we are watching Lauren's now, and try to draw conclusions from it, do professional development sessions as we do in our school, to watch videos and try to develop common guidelines as to how far we go in using other languages than English necessarily. You may have noticed that Lauren opened and closed in English, and it was the middle where she had some instances of translanguaging, a little bit like the preview and view and review that I mentioned today, only this will be a micro alternation within a relatively short stretch of language. Each of us can develop our own translanguaging idiolect. And if you're a coordinator or a director, that can be your job, to actually try and assist teachers in developing their translanguaging idiolect and draw guidelines within which, well, one of the things to decide is how much freedom does each teacher have as far as how much translanguaging they can use. A few more ideas. Mathematics is a language in itself. It goes beyond Spanish, English, French, and Chinese. So it's an excellent opportunity to work on problem solving and a number of numeracy skills that can enrich not only the target language, but also our students' mother tongue. Arts, the concept of language in action, is super interesting because with many things that we do, for example, arts, the language is not at the center, the action is, and the language accompanies and frames the action. That means that the gestures, as you could have seen with Lauren, speak for themselves, and what you're showing speaks for itself. Physical education, likewise, using total physical response kinds of activities in which you say jump. How do you say jump in Turkish, in Spanish, in French? Skip the rope, and all the verb-related actions of physical education. Music, another language in itself, which cuts across human languages. Science is a little bit like arts, because if you do a science experiment, you are showing what's going on, and the gestures and the actions can speak for themselves. So it doesn't really matter what languages are framing the activity that you're doing. It might contribute a traveling poster that can go from home to home, and each home can contribute their bits of language. Imagine you've got new students or weaker students, and you've got a PowerPoint presentation with most of it in English, but summaries in other languages. Then the weaker students, the newer students, will really feel well supported. This is actually called co-languaging, when two or more languages appear on one same piece of communication, for example, a PowerPoint presentation. Cognates, of course, allow lots of work that we can do. There's even a method that was proposed. I've only just recently been reading about it. These are the authors. They published their book in 2017. Interestingly, the title is Translanguaging, and then what they really do is they propose a cognate strategy instruction of sorts. All their proposal is based on Spanish-speaking students in the United States. This is why it's useful to me, but you can find materials for example, last year I read a collection in which it was Scandinavian countries, so a number of Swedish and Finnish schools, you know, that there is a certain amount of bilingualism and multilingualism. It's just a matter of finding the right material. So look at the spelling, how you can work on spelling and pronunciation and the written stresses that we use in Spanish. How you can work on the pronunciation. Spanish speakers and others will make mistakes with the initial clusters, sp, sk, st, by inserting a vowel before the cluster. So you can approach this by using cards of this kind. A bit of morphology like this, and you can do games like bingo, for example. That says bingo there, but you can use it with memory games, you know, like upturning the cards to try and remember the pairs or the trios of cards, or the full sums of cards. Treasure hunts, if you're already back in physical classrooms, you can hide cards and a student has one and they've got to find 2 or 3 others that correspond to the multilingual lexical items that you're providing. So a few words of conclusion. From the general perspective, stay critical of tradition. Challenge the things that you grew up with. Have a reason for it. Look for your ways to support your positions and try not to fight with anybody. Of course, if a director or a coordinator says something different from what you say, but hopefully little by little, and if you can back up the reasons why you do things you do, be ready to argue and counter-argue. There are also critics of translanguaging. No construct is accepted by everybody. I myself wouldn't have imagined talking about this 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, thinking of using mother tongues for me was really a big no-no. I would have gone to extreme lengths, you know, a very simple word and definitions of 100 words rather than maybe give a Spanish equivalent, for example. Specific conclusions related to translanguaging. If you can enable your students' languages, you'll also be respecting their identities. You'll be motivating them more. A student that feels that for at least half a minute, they've had the chance to say something in their language or about their language will probably feel much more motivated to work on the target language, let alone their self-confidence, and of course, developing a sense of international mindedness in your classrooms. Engage the families, as we said, even for languages that you do not necessarily speak. Reach out to other teachers, and with any luck, you'll find at least one who is willing to collaborate with you. Other ages, maybe you work with teachers of other ages. It doesn't need to be a teacher of the same age. Observe yourself, observe other workmates, using a WH framework, for example. What do you use translanguaging for? Where do you allow different voices and different languages? When, how, and of course, most importantly, why and what for, which I believe is at the bottom of everything we do. And again, especially if you are an early career teacher, this is, I think, what we should remember as the pyramid of teaching. Our practices, that minute by minute decision-making process, which is so fascinating about our job. which should be backed up by thoughts that we've got about languages and teaching and learning, what we think about our profession. And the bottom line, the most important bit, our belief system. What do we believe in and why do we believe in that? Do I believe in a particular position simply because that's what I've always known, simply it's what I've always learned, it's what my teachers have done with me? Or do I have the space to experiment and little by little, gradually, I've just said 20 years ago, I used to think something different, gradually move your belief system to accommodate it, in this case, to new multilingual global realities. Have I done well in terms of the timing? I think we've still got a minute or two left. If anybody wants to, I'm sorry that I haven't been able to look at the chat while I was Q&A. Well, very interesting question. I think some of them questions, some of them I think we've talked about. Emojis, that's a very interesting topic. I've recently read an article about that suggested that for the moment, there's not an idea that it will replace language, emojis and emoticons and those little smileys, as we used to call them, but rather they're an accompaniment. I personally think we should definitely use them. I think there can be a sort of multiple intelligences kind of approach. Why not? It's more artistic, and the student that's not so strong on a real language, you know, in the English sort of the word, might actually communicate quite a lot. And then you'll see how, of course, that more artsy looking work with emojis can become more concrete English communication. The other questions I think we've sort of answered. Well, websites, if you write to me, now you'll see my email again. If you'll write to me, I'll be more than glad to share some websites and resources. Mind you, translanguaging is not translation. Translanguaging is not about saying one thing in English, for example, and then repeating it in another language, right? It's about a much more complex, subtle set of decisions that we can make, which, well, 20-25 minutes can hardly be the starting point. And hopefully, if you've remained a bit hungry for more, now you'll go and listen to Ofelia Garcia, Kana Garaja, and other authors. Write to me if you want other sources. So in line with my own topic, I'm using a translanguaged thank you note, including as many languages as I could find. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you're all doing as well as possible, given the very difficult circumstances that we've had to live through this year. Thank you very much. And that's
Leandro.
my email for you to stay in touch.
Oh,
yes.
Super. Leandro, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Very good. Very good.